Hi, this is Randy, and in this video, I got to thinking before we dive in and look at each of the individual parts, I wanted to overview with you the actual process that a client goes through or the path the client goes through to get a VPN connection approved. I just felt that to keep the big picture in mind would be important before we start looking at the individual parts. So down here at the bottom, I've put together, this is actually out of my notes. I put together this path down here which kind of walks me through how this works. And there are variances to this. Different people do it different ways. Some people put the VPN server into a DMZ. There is variations, and I understand that. I just wanted to, we're going to use this as a learning platform. So here we go. So you take your VPN client out here, whatever it is, whatever operating system you've got. If you've got a VPN client, and you pick your VPN protocol. Again, I'm focusing on SSTP. Initially, I was going to do SSTP and PPTP, but then I backed down and just went with SSTP. I was a little bit concerned that Radius in this deployment uses password authentication protocol (PAP), which itself does not encrypt the passwords, and by doing PAP over SSL, the passwords are encrypted, and so I chose to just stick with SSL. My reason for also having PPTP was for any client that did not support SSTP, that PPTP is very universal. Okay, but I decided to drop that. We just did SSL. So here's how it goes. You open your VPN client and you go in there and you type in something like, VPN, in our case, .nic site.com. Okay. That then goes to your DNS provider, and now I'm referencing Cloudflare, but please keep separate that I mentioned Cloudflare in the earlier video for dynamic DNS used by Certify the web client. This is just using Cloudflare for regular DNS. You put in a fully qualified domain name, a DNS provider from the internet comes back and gives you an IPv4 and possibly an IPv6 address. Okay, now that then directs the client for IPv4. That directs them to the external part of the firewall. We'll walk IPv4 through first and then look at IPv6. The firewall then will, because we're behind the firewall with this, and this is a private network in here. This is like a 192.168.172.16 type network. The firewall then for IPv4 uses network address translation, and you do need to have those rules in the firewall to allow this. And then the network address translation forwards it then to the server. Okay, now for IPv6, IPv6 is fully routable. And so if we're using IPv6, the process is very similar. The client opens their utility, their VPN utility. They type in the fully qualified domain name. For IPv6, they are then routed to the external interface of the firewall. The firewall then has to have an inbound allow rule, no NAT involved. The packet is a rule will allow it to pass, and the packet itself is directly delivered then to your VPN server in this deployment. Okay, so everybody good with that? So that's the VPN client down here connecting to the RRAS box. So we'll just keep going down here. Now once it hits the RRAS box, there's some things that come into play here. First of all, we can put allow hours on the firewall rule. We can do that. You can put allow hours to URS, allow hours on the firewall rule. That's one level of protection. Once it hits the VPN server, from the VPN server, then in our case an RRAS box, RRAS will then pass that login request or that VPN connection request onto the network policy server. Now we're talking about the network policy server that sits on this box. When you install RRAS, you get the NPS server. Now the NPS server has two halves. It has a connection request half and a connection allow half. I don't have the terms right, but you'll see this as we dig deep and look at this more carefully. When the request comes to the RRAS server, it is then sent to this half, the top half, which can also have an hours and allow hours screening. Now, on the top half of a policy from a network policy server, you cannot specify anything other than time of day. Well, you can do a little bit of work about what kind of a request is it, but there's nothing about Windows group memberships. There's nothing about maximum connect times or idle times. Okay, so that doesn't happen there. All right, once the request then comes from RRAS, it's called a connection request policy. So the first half up here is a connection request policy. Then what I chose to do, and I'll do this in green, is I have the authentication proxy. We'll draw that right here on the same box. And so the network policy server then, if it gets through the connection request, in other words, if it meets an allowed time, it then forwards it on to the authentication proxy, which is running as a service on this box. Now, I chose to use an alternate port for this. I chose to use, normally Radius uses 1812. I added a 0 to both of that. I did that so that this authentication proxy could handle more than one feed to it or client to it. If that, I don't have one yet, I just have one, but if I wanted to have a second, something else, if I wanted, for example, to deploy OpenVPN on the firewall and let it use the same authentication mechanism, every time I do that, I need to identify a different client port. I'm hoping that as we talk about these things and then look at the configuration, that's why I wanted to overview this, is I'm hoping that by having a big picture, you could then better understand as we look at the details. Okay, so the client request hit the box here, the RRAS box. The RRAS box, by nature, by design, gives it to the connection request part of the network policy server. The network policy server is configured as to use Radius, as is the RRAS server. They're both set for Radius. Two choices are Windows authentication or Radius, and we make the switch to Radius. When you do that, when you configure the Radius on RRAS, when you actually tell it that to use Radius and you tell it what server to use, it goes in and it configures a proxy server group automatically on the network policy server. Okay, so the request came in, the network policy server said it's within the allow hours. It then used the proxy server group and forward that using port 18120 up to the Duo authentication proxy, which then is accepted the request. It then goes out and prompts for the Duo authentication. It goes out and rings your phone or whatever to say, is this really you? And then you approve it. It comes back. It then, there's a lot of lines on this here. Let me clean it up a little bit. After the Duo does its part, bear with me just a moment here. These videos are a little bit longer than I like, but I'm not finding a shorter way to explain this. Okay, so let's pick back up here. Okay, so we left off with the Duo here. The Duo did its thing, and then it sends its approval to the network policy server on the domain controller, and that also comes in as initially as a connection request policy. So it comes in here. Okay, now in this case, on the network policy server on the domain controller, it's going to use both halves. It's going to use the network connection, a connection request policy, and then also the other half of it, which is, we'll see this when we dive into this, but that's where the other half, the lower half of an NPS policy lets you specify Windows group memberships, what kind of connection, idle time, maximum time. It gives you all the control that I was looking for. Okay. Let me just do an arrow here and talk as I go, and then we'll wrap this up. All right, client looks up their server, comes through the firewall, comes to the RRAS box. The RRAS box going through NPS goes to Duo. Duo does its thing. It leaves Duo, now goes to NPS on the domain controller. The domain controller looks at group membership, time of day, other constraints, and then gives the allow, and the connection is established. All right, in my searching, this was the toughest part to understand because we're using two network policy servers. I couldn't figure out a way to use just one. We're using the network policy server on the RRAS box and on DC1. On the RRAS box, the network policy server is just used as a mechanism to forward to the Duo authentication proxy. The Duo authentication proxy acts as both a proxy and as a client. It receives the request from NPS. It then goes out and validates that you're really you, and then it acts as a client itself and then contacts the domain controller, the network policy server, which then accepts that request and then further evaluates it against time of day, connection type, group membership, and puts the constraints on the connection. How long can you connect and whatnot, and then the connection is approved. Okay, from here forward, we'll then go look at each of these boxes and show you the settings and dive a little bit deeper. Thanks for your patience, and I'll wrap up this video.